So I wanted to do a video on spiritual mistakes. It's such a common question, and I've dealt with it a lot in my own life where we get in a bad mood, or we get angry, or we're not as grateful as we should be, or we're not as mindful as we should be, or we find ourselves watching some silly sitcom and it's this real low, quote, low level of consciousness, and we're laughing at it, and we say, "Wow, that doesn't seem real spiritual." And it reminds me of a story Akatoli would tell when he had given a talk to a large group. And afterwards, he was standing in line getting some coffee. And one of the audience members said, "Well, what does a spiritual teacher need with caffeine?" And he said, "Well, what do you think a spiritual teacher should drink?" And the idea here is that the thinking mind has so many concepts about enlightenment and spirituality, but these are just ideas from the thinking mind's perspective. And so I ask people, what do you think enlightenment is about? What do you think spirituality is about? And you get some very interesting answers, from flowing robes and sort of these, images to kind of floating in space without any problems in this euphoric state. But these are all ideas the thinking mind has about enlightenment and spirituality. And we should ask ourselves, does this mean that we are spiritual, you know, versions of Pavlov's dog waiting for the bell to ring, you know? And that's the real paradox about all of this. So this happens to us. We have moments of flow and the ego is gone, time seems meaningless, and there are no problems. We get the sensation that like everything is absolutely perfect just as it is. And then at some point, the ego thinking mind turns back on and it says, wow, that was a fantastic experience. What can I do to get back to that experience? And the whole paradox is, of course, the experience came about specifically because the ego wasn't on. And so the ego wants to go to a place where its very presence makes the entire experience go away. So what I tell people is forget about your ideas about spirituality, forget about your ideas or concepts of enlightenment. These, for a lot of us, these become these kind of rewards that the thinking mind is craving. They become part of desire, and the whole thing backfires. One of the themes of the first book, The Neurotic's Guide to Avoiding Enlightenment. That's why I chose such a strange title, because you know that desire for enlightenment is exactly what takes us away from it. So there's a secret that doesn't get talked about too much about in terms of non-dualism, and it's a very interesting idea. And of course, it isn't really an idea at all. It's more of a sensation or a feeling you get when the thinking mind is turned down, and that is, no matter what happens, it's all part of it. It's always part of it. Even it not being it is still it. And so in this sense, there are absolutely no mistakes. The mistakes only come in from the thinking mind's judgment. Everything else was exactly as it was meant to be. Consider the infinite nature of consciousness. Could this be, taken over simply by, a ghost-like ego being in a bad mood? Could the problems at work somehow trick infinite consciousness into, getting into a state that it doesn't actually choose to be in? It's kind of like a parent, playing a game with their kid and they let the kid win. So these things that the thinking mind thinks are mistakes are really just sort of a game where, without it actually, it all being part of the flow, none of it would actually happen. And I think it goes back to one question, and it's not an easy one to answer because you can't answer it from the perspective of the thinking mind. The thinking mind is an eternal skeptic, but when you have certain states that the thinking mind gets turned down a little bit, then you can really ponder this question. And it's simply, do you trust the universe? If you trust the universe, you, not your ego, not your thinking mind, which is really just kind of like, do you trust yourself? And when you get into that state, that's when you see that there really are no mistakes. They're just what we might call happy accidents. Of course, I borrowed this from one of my favorite artists, Bob Ross. But I want to share a story with you that this morning I was thinking about doing this video, and my wife had been cleaning something that must have been laying around for 4 years, because the best I can tell is this tiny little scroll I have here. I must have picked up from the Edgar Cayce Museum that we visited. It must be 4 years ago. And so maybe this is all from the thinking mind's perspective, just an accident. But to me, it seemed kind of cool that I picked it up just on the day that I thought about doing this video. So it was kind of, it had a rubber band around it. It was very, like, looked very interesting, like a little scroll. And so I'm going to read it to you. And then you can sort of take it for whatever you or your thinking mind takes it for. So again, it's Edgar Cayce. The soul is in the image of God, thus eternal, everlasting. Life, in its expression then, in a mental and in a material world, is only a mental and material manifestation of the soul entity, that which was brought into being as part of creative forces. And so it comes back to that element of creativity. You know, the things the thinking mind views as a mistake are just, happy accidents in the process of creation.